Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to unpack the crucial info you need. And for you aspirants gearing up for UPSC, especially mains, listen up. We're tackling a big one today. India's move towards a structured carbon market. Think of this as getting you quickly up to speed on a key policy area.
Exactly. And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to explore India's proposed compliance-based carbon market. We're drawing heavily on that recent draft notification from the Ministry of Environment, Forests, and Climate Change. The MoEFCC, Mongabay reported on it.
Right, and understanding this is pretty fundamental for India's climate goals, the NDCs,
Yeah.
net zero targets, stuff you absolutely need for UPSC, both mains analysis and prelims context.
Absolutely essential. And it's not just one single approach they're taking either. There are actually two parallel tracks running here.
Yeah.
A mandatory compliance market and then also a voluntary carbon market.
Okay, two tracks. So let's start with the mandatory one, the compliance system. How does that actually work at its core?
Well, the core idea revolves around emissions intensity targets. It's essentially a cap-and-trade system. The government sets limits, caps, on how much greenhouse gas certain industries can emit relative to their, say, economic output.
Relative to output, okay.
Yeah. And if a company does better, emits less than its target, it generates these things called carbon credits. These credits then become assets they can trade. Companies that go over their limit can buy these credits to meet their obligations.
Ah, so it creates a market, an incentive to reduce emissions because those reductions have value.
Precisely. The credits are like permits to emit, and you pollute less, you have spare permits to sell.
And this draft notification, it makes hitting these targets a requirement for certain industries. It's not optional for them.
That's right. It's mandatory for the listed industrial units. They have to meet these reduced emissions targets, and if they don't, well, there are consequences. Fines, basically.
Fines. How does that work?
The Central Pollution Control Board, the CPCB, they'll levy what's called environmental compensation if a company fails to meet its target.
Okay, got it. So which industries are actually on this initial list? Who's obligated right now?
In this first phase, it's 282 industrial units. They're spread across 4 sectors: aluminum, cement, chlor-alkali, and pulp and paper.
282 units. Any standouts there?
Definitely the cement sector. It has the highest number, by far, 186 units. And that's significant because cement accounts for roughly 5.8% of India's total carbon emissions. So clearly a focus area.
Makes sense. And is this list fixed, or will more industries be added later?
The plans to expand it. The government has indicated they intend to bring in other major sectors down the line. We're talking fertilizer, iron and steel, petrochemicals, petroleum refineries. These are big emitters too.
Right, bringing them in would be crucial for the overall impact.
Absolutely vital.
Now, something the Mongabay report flagged was a major exclusion, the power sector. That's huge, isn't it? Like nearly 40% of emissions.
It is huge, 39.2% to be
Right.
precise.
Yeah.
And yes, their exclusion at this stage is probably the most debated aspect.
So what's the official reason for leaving them out for now?
The stated rationale, according to the report, circles around worries about costs. The concern is that including them might push up costs for power distributors, and that would eventually hit consumers' electricity bills.
Okay, I can see the concern there. But is that the whole story?
Well, experts like Vaibhav Chaturvedi from CEEW push back a bit on that. He points out, quite rightly, that the power sector already deals with other major obligations, like renewable purchase obligations, RPOs.
Right, they have to buy a certain amount of green energy.
Exactly. And that hasn't led to, completely unmanageable price hikes. So his argument is maybe the cost concern is a bit overstated. His view, basically, is that for the carbon market to be truly effective, the power sector needs to be in, and preferably sooner rather than later.
That's a really critical point for you listeners doing UPSC analysis, weighing those arguments. Now, you mentioned the system uses emissions intensity. Can you break that down? What is it, and why use that measure for India?
Sure. Emissions intensity is, simply put, how much carbon dioxide is emitted per unit of something economic output, or a specific activity like making a ton of steel. It's a measure of carbon efficiency, really.
Efficiency, okay.
And according to Hisha Mundal from the Environmental Defense Fund, this intensity-based approach is seen as suitable for a developing, growing economy like India. Instead of a hard cap on total emissions, which might stifle growth, it incentivizes getting more efficient, reducing emissions relative to economic activity.
So you can grow the economy, but you have to do it more cleanly.
That's the idea. It's considered a more, perhaps, balanced approach during economic expansion. Even if total emissions rise slightly in the short term with growth, the rate of emissions per unit of growth should fall.
Interesting. But I guess a question for analysis could be, does focusing on intensity risk delaying absolute reductions needed globally?
That's exactly the kind of critical thinking needed, yes. It's a trade-off.
So beyond just the trading mechanism, what are the bigger picture goals stated in this draft notification?
It lays out two main objectives pretty clearly. First, obviously, is helping India meet its climate targets, its NDCs, under the Paris Agreement. That means reducing, removing, or avoiding greenhouse gases. And second, it aims to push industries, especially the heavy emitters, to adopt cleaner, more sustainable technologies.
And which greenhouse gases are covered initially? Just CO2?
Primarily CO2, but also perfluorocarbons, PFCs, are included right from the start.
And maybe just a quick refresher for everyone on India's main climate pledges.
Right. India has committed to cutting its greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 45% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. And the longer-term target, the big one, is achieving net zero emissions by 2070. This carbon market is meant to be a key tool to get there.
A 45% intensity reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2070. Got it. Now, how do they figure out the starting point, the baseline emissions, for all these 282 factories? Sounds complicated.
It is detailed work, yeah. The Bureau of Energy Efficiency, the BAE, they're the ones administering this market. They handle that. They've calculated baselines for each specific plant or unit. It involves looking at all emission sources. Energy use, emissions directly from the industrial processes themselves, and even indirect emissions associated with their operations.
Okay, so it's quite comprehensive. The Manga Bay piece also mentions something about the compliance period being quite short, just 2 years initially.
Yes, that's another point Vaibhav Chaturvedi raised as a potential concern. The draft sets targets for just 2 compliance years initially, 2025-26 and 2026-27.
And why is that potentially an issue?
Well, his argument is that a 2-year window might be too short for companies, for investors to make big decisions. Investing in major new, cleaner technology often requires long-term certainty about the rules of the game. Plus, getting approvals takes time. Such a short initial period could create a bit of instability or hesitancy for those big investments.
Right, investors like predictability. That makes sense. So, stepping back, what's the overall feeling about the impact this initial phase will have, especially with the power sector out?
The Center for Science and Environment, CSE, did an analysis mentioned in the article. They estimate that even if all industries eventually join by 2030, the market might only cover around 20–22% of India's total emissions. But with this initial limited scope, focusing on just these 4 sectors, and crucially, without the power sector.
The coverage is much lower initially.
Much lower. CSE estimates it's probably closer to just 10% of national greenhouse gas emissions right now. Their point is clear. Excluding the power sector really limits the potential emission reductions this market can drive, at least in these early stages.
So a necessary step, perhaps, but maybe a smaller one initially than some might have hoped.
That seems to be the assessment, yes.
Okay, that gives us a good picture of the mandatory compliance market.
Yeah.
What about the other track you mentioned, the voluntary carbon market? How does that fit in?
Right, the voluntary market. This also falls under the BE's administration. But the key difference, as the name suggests, is that participation is optional. Companies or projects choose to get involved.
Okay, so they're not forced to, but they can't opt in. How does it work?
Entities can generate or buy carbon credits from projects that prove they've reduced or removed greenhouse gas emissions. So it complements the compliance market by offering another avenue for climate action.
And what kind of projects can generate these voluntary credits?
The BEE has already proved 8 different types of activities or offset mechanisms. It's quite a range. You've got things like planting trees, afforestation, and improving energy efficiency, but also more advanced stuff like producing green hydrogen or capturing methane from landfills, livestock, even households.
Green hydrogen, methane capture. Interesting. Now, a word that always comes up with carbon credits is additionality. Why is that so important here?
Oh, additionality is absolutely critical. It's the bedrock of credibility for any carbon credit voluntary compliance. Managed Upkara from Ekai Energy Services and also the Carbon Markets Association of India really emphasize this. A credit must represent a genuine emission reduction that would not have happened otherwise in a business-as-usual scenario.
So the project has to be truly additional. It can't be something they were going to do anyway.
Exactly. If the project would have happened regardless, then the credit doesn't actually represent any extra benefit for the climate. It has to be because of the carbon finance incentive.
And how on earth do you prove that? How do you establish what would have happened?
That's the tricky part. It relies on setting a credible baseline scenario. What would emissions have been without this specific project? It involves using really rigorous methodologies, standardized tools, and often making quite conservative assumptions to avoid overcrediting, to avoid inflating the reductions.
Sounds complex, ensuring that baseline is accurate.
It is. Robustness and transparency in setting that baseline are key for people to trust the environmental integrity of the credits.
The article also mentioned a link to the past, to the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, under the Kyoto Protocol.
Yeah, so there's a connection. India was actually a major player in the CDM, supplying a huge number of credits. Some of the methodologies being used now for the voluntary market are adapted from those developed under the CDM.
But the CDM had its issues, didn't it? Some criticisms about the quality or value of credits.
It did face criticism, yes. There were cases where the additionality was questioned, or projects seemed to inflate their emission reduction claims. Manish Dabkar highlighted that India's current voluntary system has tried to learn those lessons.
How so? What's different now to ensure more integrity?
There's a much stronger emphasis now on, well, environmental integrity, robust governance structures, and making sure everything aligns with India's national climate goals. The process for approving projects and issuing credits is significantly more stringent.
More stringent how? What does the process involve?
It's multi-layered. First, projects need validation, and then verification by accredited independent third-party agencies. Think of them as auditors. But it doesn't stop there. The findings are then scrutinized by subject matter experts, reviewed by a dedicated technical committee.
Wow, multiple levels of checks.
Exactly. And the final approval comes from the National Steering Committee for the Indian Carbon Market, the NSCICM. This whole transparent multi-stage review process is designed specifically to prevent the kinds of issues, the questionable credits, that sometimes cropped up under older systems.
Okay, that sounds much more robust. This has been incredibly insightful, really getting into the weeds of both market types. Let's try and summarize the main takeaways for our listeners, especially those keeping an eye on this for UPSC.
Sounds good. So key points. India is launching a structured carbon market system. 2 parts. A mandatory compliance market for specific industries, and a parallel voluntary one. The compliance market starts with sectors like cement, aluminium, chlor-alkali, pulp paper. Big emitter, the power sector, is out for now. It's a major point of discussion.
Right, and it uses emissions intensity targets, seen as suitable for India's growth context.
Correct. Then on the voluntary side, there's a real push for credible carbon offsets, focusing hard on additionality and learning lessons from the CDM. This involves rigorous checks, multiple layers of verification and validation, aiming for high environmental integrity.
And for you listening, prepping for UPSC, this is prime material. It connects environment, economy, international policy, crucial for mains, potentially useful for prelims context too. It's definitely part of that daily UPSC mains current important topic discussion series you need to follow.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with some things to think about, doesn't it? Here's the thought for you to ponder. What really are the long-term consequences of keeping the power sector the biggest piece of the puzzle out of the mandatory market, even if just initially? Or, looking at the voluntary side as it scales up, what are the biggest hurdles to ensuring that market maintains its integrity and genuinely delivers climate benefits?
Really important questions for critical analysis. Definitely things to mull over. If you found this deep dive useful for getting your head around this complex but vital policy, especially for your UPSC journey, please do give us a like, subscribe for more deep dives. And definitely leave a comment if you have questions. Your feedback really helps us focus on what matters most to you.
And just as a final note for your reference, all the details we discussed today were based on that excellent reporting by Mongabay. They provided the crucial insights into how this is all unfolding.